All right, in the last example, the last video, we talked about setting the width of we talked about grids and we said you could set it in specific values like pixels. You can even use auto. And that gives you a little bit more of a relative value. But there's the even better way to do this, which is you could use percentages. Percentages mean rather than giving an exact value of something, like, exactly 500 pixels or exactly 200 pixels, you could say, well, I want this column to be half of the page, or I want the column to be a third of whatever the page is. Okay. So here we're going to first create this, and then we're going to create the same layout really quickly and change it really quickly using CSS. Once again, let's just kind of look at the way this is structured, because that's important. So just like with my other examples, I have a container, a div with a classic container. This is the parent. These are the direct children. Okay, each one has some text about a tech company. What I'm going to do is take that container and let's set that to be display grid. Okay, so it's going to take the div, which is normally a block, and make it display like a grid, kind of, like an Excel spreadsheet. Now, we've done this before where it's like, well, if you just say grid, that doesn't really change your content very much. So what I need to do is say, how many columns do I want? Grid template columns. Instead of doing a specific value like 400, why don't we set this to like more of a percentage? Okay. So what I've done here is a 50-50 split. What that means is we're going to have two columns, and the first column is going to be 50% of whatever the width of the page is, the browser. And the second one's also going to be 50%. Okay. And if I go back, this is now 50%. So the reason why you're probably going to want a relative value when you do projects is we live in an era now where when you set up a website, back when I was learning web development, there really was only kind of desktop computers, kind of like the one that I'm recording on now. But now we live in a world where it's like, well, this website has to work on a desktop. It has to work on a smartphone. It has to work on a tablet. Maybe it's being displayed on a smart TV that has a browser built into it. Some TVs have that. And it's like, the problem with that is all of these different devices, these computers, laptops, smartphones, tablets, whatever else Apple invents, they don't have the same dimensions, right? Like the actual width of my desktop here is actually much wider than my smartphone, okay? And we'll eventually kind of talk about this. This is a general concept that we're going to, talk about called responsive design. And I don't want to get into like all the technical aspects, but what a responsive design means is we want our design to work for any size device, okay? And one easy way to kind of think about it is instead of thinking everything as pixel perfect, I want this to be 500 pixels, I want this to be 500 pixels, it's better to sort of think of it as sort of as a percentage of the page. I want this to be half of the page wide. I want this to be a third of the page wide. I want this to be a quarter of the page wide, okay? That makes it easier to kind of think about because two columns here is the same as two columns at the smaller size, right? It's still two columns. I haven't changed that. It's just that the actual width of each column has changed, right? And this is more of a responsive design, as we would call it. Now, there's more responsive design than just setting up columns and percentages and all that, but this is at least giving you the idea that like, okay, if two different people download my website, they're both going to get the same rough design, even if it's not exactly pixel perfect. Okay. And I'm going to tell you as a web developer, if you're a pixel perfect kind of person, you're going to have to let that go. There's just no way to do that. In the modern world, there's too many devices and too many dimensions. You can't do it. It's just not feasible realistically. Okay. Now let's just say for the sake of argument, I showed this to my client and they're like, these columns are really wide. I don't really want that. What if we did it as, let's make 3 columns. We want each column to be a third. So it's like, okay, well, 33, 33, 33. In other words, each column is going to be about a third of the page. And now I have a third of the page. Now, the reason why I showed you this is look how quick and easy that was just to switch the number of columns. Okay. When I was, 15, even 10 years ago, that would have been a lot harder to do. And now it's like literally one line of code. I can switch this really quickly and easily. Okay. Now, you might notice that these are kind of equidistant. You might say, what's the difference between this and auto? Because actually, if I did auto, you would end up with, at least in this case, the same result. So you can see that I'm still getting the same thing. The difference between this is that when you use auto, it has to be, auto has to divide everything equally. In other words, like this has to be third, 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 or if I have two of them, it has to be 50-50. In other words, each column has to have exactly the same value. What percentages might allow you to do is say, well, I want something to be, 60-40. So in this case, they're not exactly equal. This is smaller than this. And that's something you would not be able to do with auto. So just showing you like, why would we do that? All right, let's talk about rows. Let's look at exercise 5. Here's what I'm trying to create. And I have a 2-column layout. And what I want you guys to notice is that each row has a different height. Okay. So we talked about this where it's like, what if, just for the sake of argument, this column height was much higher than these two. Okay. Defaultly, what happens with our previous is that the height is based on the amount of content. Okay. So in other words, like this first row, the content is basically as tall. It's the minimum that the largest amount of content is. So in other words, this one is a taller amount. So it's pushing this row down. But if I were to go into here, which one was that? That was the animal one. If I were to go into here and, just get rid of a bunch of content, that would actually make my height smaller. Because defaultly, it's just based on the amount of content. So I'm going to just get rid of that, save. See how the height gets up. But sometimes we want to set an exact height. And that's where grid rows come into play, grid template rows. So I'm going to come in here and let's set this to a 2-column layout. So container, display, grid template columns. I want a 2-column layout. I want them to be, for now, they're just going to be 50-50. So I'm just going to do 50%, 50%. You could use auto, but to be honest, auto is really more meant for when you have like one extra column and you don't care. It's not really meant to sort of equally divide as much. But all right, so I have a 2-column layout here and I want to set heights for my rows. So let's do that. Grid template rows. And we're going to set the first one to 400 pixels, the second one to 500, and the last one or the third one to 250. Okay, so in other words, each row is getting a different height. And there you go. And let's click on this and click on row. Insert row, your boat joke somewhere here. All right. So once again, I turned on the grid just so we can kind of see the values here. And you can see how this is the height, 400, 500, and then 250. Okay. All right. In addition to having rows and columns, we can also put gaps between those rows and those columns. So we're going to create something that kind of looks like this. This is a 2-column layout. I just want you to notice that there's a space between the there's a sort of a column gap here. We would call this a gutter in print design. And there's also this row gap. Okay, hopefully you guys see that. And once again, just going to set this up as a 2-column layout. So let's do 50%, 50%. All right, so you can see my 2 columns here. I want to put a space here, and so that would be a column gap. And I could set an amount, like, I don't know, 50 pixels. Let's go back. And there you go. Okay, you can see that space there. Let's say I wanted to put a space between my rows. That would be, you probably guess, a row gap. Okay, let's do 75 pixels. And let's take a look at this. So my grid. I guess it's not showing the grid amount or the gap amount, sorry. Maybe on Firefox they do that. It's kind of it should do that, but I guess they don't. All right. There's also, if you want to set both, there's actually a shortcut or a property that'll handle both. And that is called grid gap. I believe it's row first and then column. So if my row gap is 75, it would be 75 first, and the column gap is 50. Let's save, and it should stay the same. There you go. Okay, you can do either way. This is just a way to do it with 1 line of code as opposed to 2. You may see it this way if you look at other people's codes. Just understand that this is basically the same as doing the row gap and the column gap. Okay. All right. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this before we move on to the next one. So let's just say for the sake of argument, I'm going to set this up as a 3-column layout. And just for the sake of argument, I'm not going to do a row gap. So I'm just going to do grid column gap. And I'm just going to set this to 100 pixels. Okay. And I'm going to go into here. And if you take a look at my situation, I have 1 column, 2 column, 3 column, and you'll notice that the 3rd column is actually going like off of the default size of my browser. You have to scroll to the right, which people hate more than anything in the world. They hate scrolling to the right. Why is that happening, right? Like, we set up the percentages correctly, right? 33.33, 33 and a third, 33 and a third, 33 and a third is 99.9%, right? Or 99.99%. So why is it going off of the page? And the answer is that when you do the calculation of the actual width, the column width does not defaultly include gaps. So gaps are added on top of that. So in other words, my column width is then added to my column gap. So, if I had less than 100%, then it'd probably be okay. But since I had 99.9% plus 2 columns, or sorry, two gaps, right? And each one is 100. So that means I have 100 plus 100. So really what's happening is my grid here is 99.9%, 99.99% plus 200 pixels, which is actually more than the width of the actual page. And that's why you end up with this, okay? And, you know, we could solve this problem by setting my gap to a percentage. I could probably, you know, I don't know. You know, we could do something where we pull out the calculator and it's like, all right, this is 32, 32, 32, which would give me 96%. And then, you know, that gives me 4% left, and then I could do 2%. And like, you know, we'd have to figure out the math to make this all work, and then that should work, but that's a real pain in the butt what I had to do there, right? And maybe you go back, and then if I decide to make this a different amount, then I have to redo all of this, and it's a real pain, okay? So they have come up with a solution to this. And this is how you're probably going to see most people measure columns if you look at other people's code for CSS grids. And it's something called a fraction. Okay. A fraction, at least in CSS, is a measurement or width after, or with available space. Okay. So what do I mean by that? So here's what we're going to do. I have this, and we're going to create a two-column layout. It's going to look like this. Okay. Once again, I'm just going to set this to a display grid. And grid template columns. And let's just for now do 50%, 50%. Okay. And I'm going to do a column gap of 100. And we're going to get that same problem. Okay. What fraction will do is the way fraction works is your browser will first figure out its width, and then it's going to subtract any column gaps. Okay. Now in this case, I only have one, but if I had 2, 3, 10, whatever, it's going to figure out how much that gap is. In this case, it's 100, and it's going to subtract that. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this browser is 1,000. Well, if it's 1,000 and there's one gap of 100, all right, we'll subtract 100. And now I have available space of 900 pixels. Okay. So that's the first step. It figures out how much actual available space it is. Okay. The second thing is you can figure out, you can break this down as a fraction. Okay. The way I like to think of it is kind of like a pizza. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you have a pizza, let's say, you know, there's 3 people and you have one pizza, and everyone's going to get, we want each person to get the same amount. All right, well, you would say, well, okay, if there's 3 people, take this pizza and divide it. Let's pretend this is an equal amount. It's probably not equal there, but you know, each person gets 1/3, 1/3, and then 1/3. Okay. But then let's just say, okay, well, there's 4 people. So rather than each person getting 1/3, okay, each person should get 1/4, right? 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. Okay. So, you know, we're taking the number of, like, you know, divisions we're doing, and then each person gets an equal amount. Okay. Now you might say that sounds a lot kind of like auto, and that's true, but technically we don't have to divide it evenly. Okay. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, I have 2 people. One person's an adult and one person's a child. Okay, so the idea is like, well, the adult's going to eat more than the child. So rather than dividing the pizza into one half and one half, maybe we're going to divide it where, okay, the adult gets 2/3 and the child gets 1/3. Okay. And that's kind of what fractions allow us to do. We can decide what fraction of the available space our column should be. So what I'm going to do is go back here and I'm going to switch this from 50% to 1FR, 1FR. Okay. FR in CSS is short for fraction. And what it does is it looks at this and it goes, okay, there are I'm dividing this into two parts, and each part is actually equal. Okay. So in other words, it's a 50-50 split. So it's going to take the available space, divide it, in this case, evenly. That's not always going to be the case, but in this case it is. And say, okay, well, the first column is going to be 400 pixels and the second column is going to be 400 pixels. Okay. So if I save and refresh, you get that. Okay. Let's just say for the sake of argument, I want to have 3 columns. Actually, let me show you. Okay, let's say for the sake of argument, I want the first column to be twice the size of the second. Well, I could do this. 2FR, 1FR. So what the browser is going to do is it's going to go, okay, well, there's 900 pixels of available space. There's 3 total fractions, but the first one's getting 2/3 of that, and the second one's getting 1/3 of that. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So 2/3 of 900 is 600. So the first column would be 600, and the second column would be 300. Okay, so it's still kind of, this is kind of nice in that it's like a percentage. The difference is percentages don't count, don't include the spacing, but fractions do. So you're never going to go 100% of the page. Okay. In my design here, let's say I wanted to have 3 columns, each that are equal. I could say 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. This is the same thing in that you're telling the browser there are 3 parts, but in this case, rather than one of them getting 2/3 of it, each one is getting equal amounts, or each one is getting 1/3. Okay, the result of this would be each is a third, and I'm adding another column, but that's okay because what happens is the browser subtracts the column gap first and then divides the rest of these evenly. You'll notice that the column gap isn't changing even if I make the browser bigger or smaller. Okay. The last thing I want to show you is you can write your CSS like this. This is perfectly fine and legal. You're going to see a lot of times, if you look at code online or, if you watch some video on YouTube or whatever, you might see someone do this. Okay. This is called a repeat function. And basically what it does is it repeats whatever is inside of here. So for instance, if I say 300, what this would mean is that the first number is how many times are we repeating it? How many repeat? So in this case, whatever we're repeating is 300, or sorry, anything we're repeating is 3 times. The second number is what is the actual width, or what is the value, I should say. This is the value. So this is the same as me writing 300, 300, 300 here. So if I were to save, each of these should be 300 because that's what we wrote here. We're not going to use pixels, although you could you could do it with pixels this way if you wanted to. In this case, I'm going to say 3, 1FR. This means we're going to have 3 columns, each that's 1 fraction in terms of its width. Or if I want to have 4 columns, oops, not 43 columns, but 4 columns. Or 5 columns. I don't think I have enough actually. I guess I do. There you go. All right. So that's, you don't have to write it this way, but I will tell you that if you use ChatGPT or, you're looking online, you're probably going to see columns, CSS grids, columns being laid out this way. So I just want you to kind of get used to the notation, just because this is probably realistically how other people are going to do it. So I just want you to get comfortable. If this is kind of confusing for you, just write it, like this for now until you feel more comfortable. Either way is fine. It's, but just in case you see other people's code and you're like, wait, what is this repeat thing doing? All it's doing is repeating the same code multiple times. It's just a faster way of doing it, especially if you have multiple columns instead of me having to do this like 10 times. If I had 10 columns, rather than me having to write out one FR 10 times, I could just write that little function and it's a little bit easier to read as code. Okay. All right. So I want you guys to try that out. Just play around with grid gaps, row gaps, fractions, percentages. This is really the basis of CSS Grid. So hopefully this is making sense. It's kind of like I said, it's like working with an Excel spreadsheet. In the next video, we will talk about spanning. Okay, what spanning allows you to do is have a setup where you can have an item that can go more than one column, or it can go multiple columns, or you could have something go more than one row. It can go multiple rows. Okay.